Hello everyone, and today we're going to be having our first official look at Tearlament. Now, we are back to 100%, I don't sound like I'm dying anymore, so that's a good start. This is not necessarily like going to be an expert guide or anything like that, because it is still something I'm getting used to. I've been playing the deck a good little bit now, so I'm getting pretty familiar with it. This is going to be a showing of the pure sort of Tearlament Ishizu type build that is going to be the most common on the ladder. I feel like this is going to be the one that has the highest skill ceiling for sure, and is definitely going to be very tricky to get around and play around. We're going to keep this intro nice and short. We are going to be doing a card for card at the end of the video, so stick around for that if you're interested. We do have sort of like a mixed bag of results. I feel like people are going to be playing either this in the mirror match, or they're going to be playing decks built specifically to counter this. So there are situations in which you're going to find yourself struggling, especially if your opponent is simply better at playing Tearlaments than you, which of course is going to be the situation for me in quite a number of cases until we get a little bit more practice in. But we are getting there. We've got a sort of a mixed bag of results, like I said. We're going to go through a bunch of replays. I'm going to talk us through them, sort of explain why we're doing certain plays, explain why we're playing certain cards. So stick around, watch the gameplay so you can learn a little bit more about the deck. You can't really learn to play this deck from a video or from someone watching. You need to pick it up and practice with it if it is something you're interested in playing. But at the very least, hopefully watching this video will get you started. So we're going to be doing card for card at the end, bunch of replays. If it's your first time on the channel, or maybe you've been around but you just haven't subscribed yet for whatever reason, I would implore you to do so. You know, it doesn't hurt you, it doesn't cost you anything, helps me out, helps you out, everybody wins. And if you wouldn't mind liking the video as well, it does help me out, but it's only if you enjoy what you're watching, of course. And I'm not going to milk it anymore, let's just get into the gameplay. So one of the biggest problems we were actually having with this deck was securing decent replays to show, because more often than not, if you were going to be in a situation where you have a somewhat playable or decent hand, your opponent normally just surrenders. So the turns and plays we're going to be seeing definitely aren't ideal, because in situations where we did have the ideal play, our opponent usually just gives up right away. Now, we are going to be playing Kelbeck's effect here, actually, just to cut our opponent off during the branded combo. I love Kelbeck's effect in hand. It's a surprisingly underrated hand trap. Being able to bounce Lubellion back to the extra deck, preventing him from summoning the Mirror Jade, forcing him to instead summon out Masquerade the Blazing Dragon. Significantly less powerful, of course. Gonna go for the Pot of Desires, drawing 2, setting 2, and passing. So we averted most of the damage that could have been inflicted by his board here. We have a somewhat solid hand, but we do need to be careful around that Masquerade. We're going to go Keldo, dropping Kelbeck, searching for Agido. That's going to activate Masquerade. We're going to trigger Kelbeck, milling an additional 5 cards, triggering Masquerade again so we can use our Rhino Heart as well as the Agido in our hand. So we're using Agido to basically fill up our field with rank 4 materials so we can either start Exceed Summoning or Link Summoning, which isn't typically something you're going to do with the deck, but I'm a bit more of an explosive player. I prefer sort of playing with pedal down. I just want to go full turbo. We're going to go in the Kaleido Heart here. I really didn't want to mess around too much with Masquerade. So the thing about Tear is that by the time you actually get to the stage where you're going to start attacking, you're going to activate a million card effects. Our life points are already so low that I didn't really want to dance around with the Kick Close or anything. So we're just going to go straight in the Kaleido Heart. We're going to try removing that Masquerade before it becomes a problem. But unfortunately we get Imperm, so we have no choice but to go into battle and take it out the old-fashioned way. Masquerade is off the field, so we're just going to Link Summon now. We did have the option to go into Abyss Dweller here, which is phenomenal in the mirror match and against a number of other decks, but against this deck in particular, it's really not all that good. So what we're going to do instead is we're simply going to keep Masquerade here so that at any point during our opponent's turn, we could either Unicorn, or more so to my point, we could go into the Underworld Goddess. That was more so my plan at the time. We're leaving ourselves with plenty of options in either direction, plus we got Call by the Grave should we need it, so we're feeling pretty confident. Masquerade activating its effect. We're going to preemptively use Mudora. We also have Keldo, so we didn't really mind using Mudora here. We still have more interruption in the grave should he decide to go for something like Branded in Red anyways. He's going to activate the other Pot of Desires he had set, drawing 2, normal summoning the Edge Chain so we can go into Predaplant Verte Anaconda. This is when we're going to use our Masquerade. I'm going to preemptively remove the Verte Anaconda from the field. It goes Herald of the Orange Light in Branded for some reason. Drew his one of Herald. We hit it with Call by the Grave, and that is all she wrote. Next turn, we just go directly for lethal. Our opponent didn't have any plays apparently. Sucks to suck. Sometimes it's just that easy. Not exactly your typical tier game. Like I said, you're not going to see a lot of the typical ideal gameplay because they always surrender. So, I mean, I can't show off what doesn't happen. But either way, a pretty decent showing. Some of the possibilities, some of the combos, some of the cards. You get the message. Let's get in the game too. This game, if I can remember correctly, is going to be a lesson in humility. We're going to go Reinhardt here, Reinhardt dumping the Harvest from the graveyard, so all of the Tearlament cards, like I'm going to cover later in the deck profile, apart from Reinhardt, have the same effect, where if they're sent to the graveyard by a card effect, they will allow you to fusion summon by shuffling cards back into the deck. So typically you're going to use that to go into Kit Kolos. Which is pretty solid. Kit Kolos then is going to grab our Mary from the deck. Because we didn't have any other tiers in hand, we get a little bit restricted with what we could search. We sort of had to go for Merly. So Kit Kolos is going to mill 5, Merly's going to mill 3. So milling 8 cards is going to give us a significant possibility of milling some really useful cards. So we're going to grab Siren off of the Trap card. We're going to summon Siren by dropping the Keldo, milling an additional 3 cards. Going off into Sprite Elf. Unfortunately, our mills were just really bad. We just didn't mill like any useful cards, which was really unfortunate. So what we're doing is we're setting up Sprite Elf so that during our opponent's turn we can summon Merly and hopefully mill a Tearlament card. Considering so many of them are still in our deck that we didn't mill any of the fusion ones, we still have so many names, as well as the Ishizu cards that could potentially be milled. There's a lot of possibilities off of a mill 3. Our opponent's going to go Magical Mallet, and that's when you know that there are shenanigans afoot here. They're going to go into Planet Pathfinder. We're going to preemptively Merly to see if we can mill anything to let us fusion summon. Unfortunately, we don't. The plan was trying to hit potentially any of our tier names, any of our Ishizu names to fusion summon into a Kaleido Heart to shuffle back his Pathfinder before he could use it to search for anything. Unfortunately, we just got really ridiculously unlucky. Sucks to suck. We are going to Ash Blossom the Pathfinder anyway. I really would have rather saved that, but you know, it is what it is. Now that we've used up our cards, he is at this stage going to go for Raigeki, which I find a very interesting choice, considering it is going to trigger our Merly, but this is exactly what he wanted. We're going to bring out the Tearlament's Rukalos. Now he's simply going to activate Numeron Network from the hand. He just had it. He just had it. I don't know what to tell you. Swings in, boosts up by double, swings in, boosts up to double, swings in, boosts up again, up to 8,000 attack points, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is a lesson in humility. If you can see any of course there's going to be misplays, but I did also just get supremely unlucky with the mills, but either way, there you go. You're not invincible. Tier is not going to be unbeatable, and a lot of luck, particularly with this version of the deck, does come down to whether or not you can hit the cards you need to hit. Mathematically speaking, there is a significant possibility that you will. You're stacking the odds in your favor, but there's always the chance you roll a 0, right? So it is what it is. Let's get into game 3. Alrighty, getting into game 3 here. We are going first, and we draw instant fusion. Now, the Maxi does ruin our day a little bit. I can't remember if we play into it or not in this particular instance. I believe we play into it a little bit. So Kit Kolos comes out. We're going to activate Kit Kolos, grabbing Scream from the deck. We're simply going to activate Scream. We're going to normal summon the Medora just to trigger off Scream. We're going to trigger our Kelbeck then, setting Sulik. Now, I sort of forgot, right, and this is my bad, at the end of the turn that the Kit Kolos is going to get destroyed by instant fusion. It does trigger a mill 5, which is nice. Agido then triggering as well. Our opponent is playing Spiral, which holds a ton of combo potential. Reinhardt's going to activate during the end phase, summoning itself, dropping the Siren. Again, we decide we're going to summon a couple of cards here. It's fine. We maybe shouldn't have, but it is what it is. We're going to send the Merly just so we have it in the graveyard to use. We're going to bring out Rukalos, gives us a negate, as well as keeping our Sulik alive. We need to have a Tearlament card face up for this to be usable. So that's the big idea. We're going to go Terraforming, grabbing the last, the Spiral Resort, sorry. Spiral Resort is a once per turn search for any Spiral monster, and that's not a hard once per turn, so if you have multiple copies, you have multiple searches, as our opponent is displaying here. Grabbing the Super Agent directly from the deck here, they're going to activate Super Agent. This maybe wasn't the smartest in the game, but I don't know a ton about spirals, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I sort of figured that based off its effect on the field not being that impressive, I figured it was just going to be an extender, and we still have the Sullic face down to be utilized. Now we're going to trigger Merly that was sent off of our Scream as well as our Siren, and our opponent has just decided that they've had enough. In that circumstance, we were going to bring out Kit Kalos Chainlink 2, and then Chainlink 1 we were going to go into a Kaleido Heart, shuffling back the spirals or doing whatever it is we needed to do. A little bit of a situation, we've been disconnected, fantastic. It was a win. You're going to see that happening a lot. I wish I had better games to show off, but I don't have 4, 5, 6 hours to sit down and record gameplay for this deck. I simply don't. So it is what it is. Either way, let's get into our fourth and final game. Alrighty, getting into our final game here. I can't honestly remember how this one goes, but we're going to start it off with a Siren dropping Havness to the graveyard. We're going to trigger its effect off. We're going to Fusion Summon now into Kit Kalos. That's going to be your frame 1 play anytime you can get it. You want to see Kit Kalos as soon as possible. It's actually going to trigger our opponent's Havness. Now, considering the fact that we've already used Havness to Fusion Summon this turn, we're actually pretty safe to use Crossout Designator to banish it and negate his summoning. So that works out just fine for us. We're going to grab Tearlament Sullic here from our deck, and this was one of our earlier replays, where we were still learning how to play the game. What you ideally should have done here is, this is a good play if your opponent like activates Max C or something, but if you're not playing under Max C, realistically what we should have done here is, like we did in an earlier replay, grab a monster instead, so we can use Kit Kalos' second effect to send herself to the graveyard to summon the monster that you just searched for, ideally a Merly, which will do additional milling on summon, and get playing the game from there. So we should have grabbed the Merly, so misplay from us, absolutely, but this is typically what you would do if you're playing under Max C or something like that. So it's still something. We still have 3 interruptions here, plus Kit Kalos and its mill. One of our interruptions does get sniped, unfortunately, and he's going to activate the effect of the Havness here to Fusion Summon with King of the Swamp in his hand, going into Tearlament's Rugalos. Now that is going to slow us down quite a bit. Rugalos now swinging into the Kalos. We are forced to use Sullic now because it can only be used while you control a Tearlament card. We're going to negate the Rugalos as well as attempting to use the Kit Kalos' effect, but I don't believe it activated for some reason. Oh no, it did. Yeah, we milled 5. We summon out the Kaleido Heart now. Kaleido Heart's going to bounce a card back into the deck on summon. We're going to get rid of that Rugalos. It is a bit of a problem, and hopefully just sort of take it from there. We still have an interruption here in the form of Infinite Impermanence, so we can still stop a Kit Kalos should it be required. We're not activating the effect of our Graveyard Millers because we know that our opponent is playing Tearlament, so it's sort of a little bit silly, but we are going to activate the effect of the Merly as well as the Havness that we just sent. Unfortunately, our opponent has the Mudora. Mudora is going to be able to get rid of our Tearlament cards before their effects can resolve. So that's the unique way in which Tearlament sort of counters itself. The Ishizu cards are going to be returning back your Tearlament cards back to the deck in order to prevent your Fusion Summon. So one of the biggest counters to Tearlaments is Tearlaments. That's one of the biggest things that makes it a tier 0 deck. It's its own worst enemy. So we're going to banish the Keldo. Keldo's going to get bouncing as well back to his deck. We're going to bounce Exchange of the Spirit as well, because I don't know what shenanigans he's up to, but we don't want to play that game. Merly now and Rhino Heart are not going to activate their effects because they were shuffled back, so we caught each other on it pretty much even. Our opponent does have the Siren though. Siren's going to be a problem, grabbing back the Havness. And now they're going to go for Grief. So he's playing all of the Tearlament cards, summoning out a Siren and then activating its effect to Fusion Summon, and that's a pretty good card. I don't see Tearlament's Grief being played in a lot of decks, and I feel like I should see it more often than I do. It's pretty good. As far as I've seen anyway, I could be wrong. We are going to negate their Kaleido Heart on summon. We don't want ours to get spun back just yet, especially considering we should be able to recycle it off of Sullic, but we shall see. We're going to activate Sullic now, targeting the Kaleido Heart, but our opponent's going to hit us with theirs in response. They're going to send their monster to the grave before we even get the chance to send ours. That does unfortunately mean we're in a position where we cannot send our Kaleido Heart to the graveyard. We drew Merly here, so we basically just sort of have to rely upon the Merly Our Collider Heart's going to get bounced back to the deck by his, and we're seeing a bunch of graveyard action happening for our opponent here. They're going to mill a bunch of cards, they're going to fusion summon, they're going to bring out the Winda, and Winda really is the final nail in the coffin. Winda's really good in this deck. Honestly, if you want to play some shit-alls in here, even just one or two of them will do. We normal summon Merly just on the off chance in case we, I don't know, draw into a miracle. But even then, they still have the Mudora in the graveyard to completely counter us. And this time they get to target up to 5 cards because they have Exchange of the Spirit in their graveyard. Not just 3, they get to target 5. So all 5 back to the deck, shuffled, Merly does nothing, and with that, we simply have to concede. Our opponent outplayed us. It worked out to his advantage. It just is what it is sometimes. Tearlament is definitely its own worst enemy. We're going to talk more about my thoughts on the deck and the deck profile, so let's just skip ahead straight into that. Alrighty, so having a look at the deck list. Now, before we jump into the card for card, as a sort of general overview, I can definitely see why this deck is going to be so problematic. It has pretty incredible resource recovery, it has a lot of control from the graveyard, and most importantly, it's its own worst enemy, which is a pretty important note because a lot of the times in a metagame, you will typically have a meta centered around 1 or 2, maybe even 3 of the most powerful decks in the game, and the rest of the things that formulate the metagame are its counters. So you will have the counter to the meta deck, then you'll have the counter to the counter, and so on and so forth. That's generally how metas develop. In this circumstance, one of the biggest opponents to Tearlaments is Tearlaments. And not just because it's also the strongest deck, but it genuinely has significant counterplay against itself, which is going to be interesting. This version of the deck, I'm not too big on. I know it's going to be really powerful, I really do, but it's just not my speed. It's not my style. I typically play things much more explosively, much more combo heavy, and that's why I tend to misplay a lot with this deck. I feel like I'm just playing on a different speed, which is, you know, it takes time and practice, but at the same time, it's just not very fun to me. So I'm definitely going to be experimenting with Tearlaments, but I will be doing so in different ways. Branded and Punk are two in particular that I have my eyes on. I did see a glimpse of a Chaos version as well, which I will be having a look at too. So we'll be looking at a bunch of different versions of it. This is the pure version that is good, definitely, but not the most fun in my opinion. But let's get into the card for card. We, of course, to aid in our combat against ourselves in this case, we've got the DD Crow, banishing any card from the graveyard on demand. Basically an easy way to stop the Tearlaments from fusion summoning. We're going to get to these guys in just a second. Herald of the Orange Light, fantastic way to get an extra negate in hand. It's pretty decent. You know, considering it's a rare, why not? All of your Tearlaments are... no, they're not fairies. I can't remember why we played this card. Moving on. We got the double maxi. we'll get back to this. I can't remember why this is here. I remember having a reason for it. I just can't remember. Probably just the Ishizu cards. So Maxi, double Maxi, of course. Maxi is going to be one of the more consistent solid hand traps in this game. You can play it at 3. A lot of people, I'm going to skip ahead and say we're playing double Ash. A lot of people cut the Ash to play more of the counter tier cards. I still think Ash holds a place in the meta. It's not obviously as powerful as it was before tier came out, because it's not the most impactful against tier, but it's still pretty solid in a lot of situations, and against a lot of the other decks that people will be playing, you know? That still needs to be considered when you're deck building, so I still think Ash has a place. You can cut it if you want. Maxi, definitely we're playing it at least 2. We're playing a single copy of Diviner of the Herald. Basically gives you a Foolish Burial on summon, which is dope, plus it changes itself to a level 6 tuner in most cases, allowing you easy access to Baron de Fleur. So pretty solid. You can play it at 3 if you want, but I think 1 is fine. Then we're playing just as many of the tier names as we possibly can. So excluding Rhinoheart, all of the others are limited to 2, and they all have somewhat similar effects. All 3 of them, Merly, Havness, and Siren, I don't know if there's enough way to pronounce that, will, whenever they're sent to the graveyard by a card effect, will conduct a fusion summon by shuffling monsters from your graveyard, hand, or field back into the... by sending them to the bottom of your deck in any order you choose. So you get the fusion summon out, and it's not limited to tier monsters. You get the fusion summon whatever. So they all fusion summon when sent to grave, which is why there's such a heavy emphasis on sending cards from deck to grave, but they each have an individual effect that sets them apart. Merle, on summon, will send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard, making her very versatile and something you're going to utilize alongside your Kikkalos most of the time, something that took me an embarrassingly long time to figure out. We've got Havness, which is basically when your opponent activates a monster effect, you can special summon it, then mill 3, which gives this card the ability to play on your opponent's turn an awful lot, which is awesome. So Havness being able to set up even potentially as much as, if you get super lucky, a Rukalos or a Kaleido Heart during your opponent's first turn is pretty cool, if and when it happens. It's not going to be super common though, but Havness nonetheless is awesome. It helps you play through hand traps and interruptions too. We've got Siren, which you can send a monster from your hand to the graveyard to special summon it, then mill 3 off the top of your deck, which is an amazing effect. Definitely, I would say, the most versatile of the 3, being able to special summon itself. This card is awesome, and is going to be one of the better ways for you to play through most forms of interruption. So they all basically find a way to mill 3 cards, and they all fusion summon when sent to the graveyard. Then you have Rhino Heart, which is the exception. Rhino Heart, when summoned, is going to send a Tearlament monster from your deck to the graveyard, usually to trigger off their fusion effects. It doesn't really matter which one you would send, although typically you're going to have this, because you're not really going to be utilizing this card too much on your own turn. So you probably want to just utilize its fusion effect while you can, right? You would rather have Siren or Merle available to play with. So Rhino Heart, you're typically going to send Havness, but it doesn't really matter. And you're going to fusion summon. If this card is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, just like the others, instead of allowing you to fusion summon, this card instead will special summon itself, and then you will send a Tearlament card from your hand to the graveyard. So basically it tags out one to summon itself, and again, because your card is being sent by a card effect from your hand to the grave, it'll also trigger the effect of any tier card that you send to the grave. So it's a pretty versatile card, definitely one of the better starters in the deck for sure. Your dedicated normal summon, alongside Herald to a lesser extent, but Rhino Heart is more or less your designated normal summon. Now into the Ishizu cards. We've all seen them, we all know exactly what they do. I talked about them non-stop during the end of March. Keldo and Mudora can banish themselves from the graveyard to target up to 3 cards in your opponent's grave, shuffle them back to deck. Kelbeck and Agito, when sent to the graveyard by a card effect from your hand or deck, will mill 5 cards from both players' decks. Now they each have smaller individual effects that separate them. Keldo and Mudora can each special summon themselves to the field by discarding another Earth Fairy monster. Mudora, when he does this, will activate Gravekeeper's Trap directly from the deck, which we're not playing. And Keldo will resurrect a Earth Fairy monster from the graveyard, I believe. Oh no, it doesn't, sorry. Keldo will search your deck for another of your Ishizu monsters. Yeah, so Keldo searches, and Mudora will grab Gravekeeper's Trap. And then you've got Kelbeck, which Kelbeck and Agito can each special summon themselves from the hand whenever a card is sent from your opponent's hand or deck to the graveyard. Kelbeck will bounce a special summon monster they control back to the hand, and Agito will resurrect a Earth Fairy monster from your graveyard. So I just got Agito and Keldo confused. But yeah, they're most of the time, the only real effect you're going to be taking advantage of is the banish effects, the mill effects, as well as Kelbeck's bounce sometimes is useful. I really like it. So yeah, these cards are pretty solid. They're useful in a whole variety of decks. So if you're thinking about crafting these cards, but you don't know if you want to commit to tier, you don't need to play tier to play the Ishizu cards. You can play them in tons of different strategies. They're really, really versatile. Then you got Foolish Burial, because of course you do. You can trigger the effect of any one of your cards in your deck. Insane. I don't know why people aren't playing this. A lot of the lists that I've seen don't have this card in it, and I don't know why. I got Terraforming, because the field spell is broken and we don't have that many ways of searching for it, so we want to grab it as often as we can. We might end up playing more ways of grabbing the field spell. I feel like that's perhaps where I'm missing out on the true power of the deck, and maybe where I'm seeing mistakes or misplays, or where it maybe feels underpowered to me, is because I might be underutilizing the field spell. Maybe that's just me. Instant Fusion is just a guaranteed way to get all of your plays going. You can special summon Kikkalos directly from the extra deck and just get gaming. So Instant Fusion is, I've seen other YouTubers call it currently pretty much the single best spell card in Master Duel. I don't know if I would go that far, but it's definitely up there right now. Then you've got one copy, Field Spell. Field Spell does a few things. Whenever it's activated, it'll search for a Tearlament card. A Tearlament monster, specifically. Any of your Tearlament monsters and your fusion monsters gain 500 attack points. If a Tearlament monster you control or in your graveyard is shuffled back into your deck, for example for a fusion summon, you can destroy a card in the field. So it basically turns your fusion summoning into a pop, an interruption, which is awesome because you're going to be utilizing those effects quite a lot, considering Havness and your other fusion monsters are going to be milling and fusing and everything during your opponent's turn. So the field spell's destruction effect really does come into its own quite a lot if you manage to get the field spell. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of ways of searching it in this deck list, but maybe if we want to make some improvements or changes to it, we might make a few cuts to fit in some other options for searching it. Then we got Tearlament's Scream. Whenever a monster is summoned, so long as you control a Tearlament monster, you get to send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard, and for the rest of that turn, all of your opponent's monsters are reduced by 500 attack points. If it's sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can add a Tearlament's Trap card directly from deck to hand. Typically going to be searching for your Sullick, unless you feel like playing another Trap card, but typically we just play Sullick. Then we got Call by the Grave, mandatory in this meta. I'm sorry, it just is. If you don't have it, craft it. It's going to be probably... A lot of people say Instant Fusion is the single best spell card in the meta. I would probably argue that Call by the Grave takes that spot, given its versatility. Cross-out Designator is optional. We don't play a lot of great cross-out targets, I'm going to be honest with you. If you wanted to cut cross-out, you could do that. You could definitely do that, and you could put in one of something else. I don't know what else you would play. Maybe just like a third, Maxi, whatever it is you want to do, you can do. Crossout is fine, we just don't play a ton of good targets. Although Infinite Impermanence is a great target considering how bad it hurts your deck. Infinite Impermanence, of course, being able to target a monster on the field and negate it. If you don't control any cards, you can use it straight from your hand. One of the most versatile hand traps in the game, and one that is gaining a lot of power from the fact that if you can imperm their Kikkolos, you're in trouble. So imperm is definitely a major threat. Something to bear in mind. And lastly, we've got Tearlament's Sullick here. Tearlament Sullick, so long as you control a Tearlament's card, or monster more specifically, once per turn you can target an effect monster your opponent controls, permanently negate its effects, then you need to send a monster you control to the graveyard. Any monster at all. Which will usually, again, trigger the effects of your fusions, which will trigger the effect of your field spell, and summon out your interruptions, and blah blah blah. So it all sort of runs in a cyclical nature, which is pretty awesome if you can get the setup right. Again, I just can't help but feel my mistake is with the field spell. I feel like that's where we need to improve. Either way, getting into the extra deck, we're playing a couple of generic fusions as well as just the key Tearlament fusions. We got Mud Dragon of the Swamp, which is decent protection effect, plus it's very versatile in its fusion requirements. There's not really much else to be said there. Predaplant Dragostapelia, again, rather versatile with its fusion requirements, considering you're going to always have fusion monsters in your graveyard or on your field in order to summon it out, so it does come in handy pretty often. We've got Kikkolos, which is the core card of the deck, the heart of Tearlament itself. When this card is summoned, you get to grab a Tearlament's card from your deck and either add it to your hand or send it to your graveyard. So it's a fantastic way of searching for something or simply sending something to the grave in order to conduct a fusion summon. You can target a monster you control, special summon any Tearlament monster from your hand to graveyard, and if you do send a targeted monster to the graveyard, typically speaking, you're going to target itself and send itself to summon out any monster from your hand or graveyard, ideally something like a Merly for its mill effect on summon. So Kikkolos has 2 amazing effects, and getting into its third effect, which is also amazing, when it's sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you get to mill 5, which is dope. So it has 3 amazing effects that all work in combination with one another. Absolutely great card. Then we're running 2 copies of Rulkalos. Rulkalos, sorry. I always call it Rulkalos. Rulkalos. You don't need 2 of this. I just didn't know what to put in the last slot. I didn't want to play Zeus because I didn't use the Exceed monsters enough. I don't have 10 fee 3 Doer, although to be honest, I think 10 fee 3 Doer is probably the way to go. I just didn't want to craft it. but I think that this card is definitely the way to go. Why is this happening? As I was saying, Time Thief Redoer is probably going to be the way to go for that final slot instead of a second Rugalos. We'll get to Time Thief Redoer and why he's good in just a second. Rugalos, of course, is just one of your core Tearlament fusions. Once per turn, you can send a Tearlament monster you control to the graveyard or from your hand to the graveyard in order to negate the effect of a card that would special summon. While this card's face up, your other Aqua monsters can't be destroyed by battle, which is kind of useful sometimes, although it doesn't really protect anything of any significance, to be honest. But it's kind of nice, I guess. If this card is sent, this fusion summoned card is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can special summon it back to the field. Now, of course, bear in mind that once you special summon it back, it no longer counts as having been fusion summoned. So, yes, it does get to revive itself, but it only gets to do it once. Which is still pretty awesome, considering it basically can use itself to pay its own cost. But that is pretty straightforward. Yep. Then we got the Kaleido Heart. Kaleido Heart is the only one to have been given an animation. Why did you give it to Kaleido Heart and not to Kikkalos? What the hell was that about? Did they just refuse to put work into this card because they know they're going to have to ban it? Like, what was the situation there? Why Kaleido Heart? Whatever. So this card, when it's special summoned, or if an Aqua monster is sent to your graveyard while it's on the field, which is always, constantly happening, so basically just once per turn, you get to shuffle a card your opponent controls back into the deck, which is pretty solid, absolutely. Very similar in its nature to things like Tri-Brigade, Shureg the Ominous Omen, things like Dark Magical Circle, just that once per turn continuous negate, except this time it's on a 3k body, that anytime it's sent to the graveyard by a card effect, it will automatically revive itself, and then you send a tier card from your deck to the graveyard. So you actually generate advantage when they get rid of this card, plus he comes back. So he's pretty problematic. I mean, he's definitely the quote-unquote boss monster of Tearlaments, if you want to look at it that way. But this guy is absolutely incredible. We've got Baron de Fleur, generic level 10 synchro that we can access from Diviner. You're not going to use it every game, but it's definitely a solid option to have whenever you have such easy access to it. Then our Exceed monsters. Abyss Dweller is your anti-Tearlament card, as well as anti a number of other things in the meta. If your deck plays level 4s and it plays the ability to Exceed summon, absolutely play Abyss Dweller in your deck. It is essentially a huge counter to Tearlaments, even if it doesn't necessarily mesh with your own strategy. It's a nice option to have. Basically, once per turn, as a quick effect, you can detach a material, and for the rest of that turn, your opponent cannot activate the effects of any cards in their graveyard. Now, bear in mind, it prevents activation, so you can't... If you chain this card's effect to the activation of an effect engraved, or they chain the activation of something engraved to this guy, those effects aren't going to be negated. It merely prevents the activation of new card effects. So you do need to be a little bit preemptive when it comes to Abyss Dweller's effect, just to make sure you actually resolve it. Then you got Baguska. Just as a floodgate, so long as this guy is in face-up defense, everything else is switched to defense and their activated effects are negated. Baguska's pretty much here just to buy you time if you drew into a bad hand, considering how easy it is for you to access level 4s. Pretty straightforward stuff. Time Thief Redoer. This guy is interesting. So, on most of the time with an Exceed monster, you would detach an Exceed material as cost. With this particular guy, you don't. You discard the material as effect resolution. So anything you remove from this guy as material counts as having been sent to the graveyard by a card effect, which means if you were to send any of your Tearlament monsters to the graveyard, or any of your Ishizu monsters to the graveyard off of this guy as Exceed material during your opponent's turn, you can trigger any of their effects on demand, which is pretty damn useful. So Time Thief Redoer, I think for sure for that reason alone is definitely worth considering for the final slot that I was missing. It also, during each standby phase, takes the top card of your opponent's deck and places onto itself as material. And then basically what it can do is it can banish itself. You can detach up to 3 different materials and then apply the following effects. So if there's a monster attached to it, you get to banish it until the end phase. If there's a spell, you draw a card. If there's a trap, you take a face-up card your opponent controls and put it on top of the deck. You're not going to see the trap effect very often, but you'll typically see the spell effect and the monster effect pretty much all the time. Basically just means you can trigger the effects of your Tearlaments on demand. You might get to draw a card here and there, and it's a 2400 beater, you know, pretty solid. Always comes back, you know, it's hard to beat. So yeah, Time Thief Redoer is definitely very solid. I wasn't playing it in my testing, but I feel like after my testing I would definitely include it. We've got IP Masquerena, generic Link stuff. I mean, all of this is generic Link stuff except for Sprite Elf. IP to link summon during your opponent's turn. Dark to link chain up using your opponent's graveyard should you need it. Unicorn to spin a card back in the deck. Access Coup Talker to pop a bunch of cards and go for lethal. And then the Underworld Goddess of the Closed World, just to link off an opponent's problematic card, especially if you can do it during your opponent's turn using IP Masquerena. So generally speaking, just generic Link package. If you don't like any of these cards, take them out and replace them. It's whatever. They don't really matter that much. The only one that does matter is Sprite Elf. The reason this card matters is because it resonates very well with your Merle, which basically, Sprite Elf can not only protect a lot of your big monsters from being targeted, so any monster this guy points to, by the way, can't be targeted by card effects, which by itself is really, really good. But it can also once per turn resurrect any level 2 monster, so it can bring back the likes of Merle, which of course on summon is going to mill a bunch of cards, hopefully hit some Tearlaments, hopefully get some fusion plays going. It just opens up the doors to a lot more different plays. So absolutely something worth bearing in mind. And yeah, that's the full deck list. Again, it's not really something that you can pick up super quickly. Like I said, I've been playing this deck for a little bit now, and I'm starting to put it together, of course, but there's still a long way to go before I can tell myself that I've mastered this deck, of course. So there's a lot of practice involved. I don't think you're going to be able to watch a video and just walk away from that video knowing how to play this deck. I think that's silly. That's not going to happen. So if you do want to play Tearlaments, you're just going to have to play it. You're going to have to pick it up. You're going to have to lose. You're going to have to get frustrated. Do whatever it is you need to do. But eventually it'll start clicking and making sense. And a lot of practice is just what it's going to be before you can start competing with it. I'm definitely going to be testing out different variants that may be more sort of my play style. A lot more explosive, a lot more speedy. This one's a little bit slow and control oriented. Maybe I've built it wrong. Maybe there's cards I'm missing that I should be including. If there's any suggestions, any big misplays, any big combos that you think I should know that I didn't display in the gameplay, let me know, and I will attempt to do so in the future whenever I'm playing it, and we may even revisit it sometime soon. But for now, that's pretty much it. I'm going to be signing off here. If you got this far and you haven't subscribed yet, why not? You might as well obviously like what you're seeing, like the video of course, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.